There is a version of this story that circulates in the back rooms of dojos, told by men who swear they heard it from a man who was there, and whether every detail survived the decades intact is a different question than whether the lesson at its center is true. This is the story as it has come down, at a converted warehouse gym in Sherman Oaks, California, on a Tuesday evening in March of 1974. In front of 41 people seated on folding chairs arranged in 3 uneven rows. The floor was maple, scarred pale in a long diagonal where a heavy bag had dragged for a decade. The lights were caged industrial fixtures, the kind that hum. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb for 6 minutes before pulling away. None of the 41 people in that room knew they were about to watch a myth get tested against a legend and lose. He called himself a top student. 26 years old, 6'1", 198 pounds, 4 years of direct instruction under a master whose name is spoken in every martial arts hall in the English-speaking world with something close to reverence. He had the footwork. He had the hand speed. He had, by that point, sparred and defeated 11 black belts in open exhibition matches across 2 states, and he carried himself like a man who had run out of people left to prove himself against. In the next 6 seconds, a claim 4 years in the making would collapse into silence, and the room would spend the rest of that decade arguing about what it had actually seen. Nobody in that gym that night knew they were sitting inside the origin of a story that would still be told 50 years later in different rooms by people who were not yet born when it happened. The man at the center of it wore a plain white t-shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants gone soft at the knee. He sat in the 3rd row, on the aisle, a black cap pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. He had come to watch, not to be watched. He had told the instructor at the door his name was Charles, nothing more, and the instructor, 22 years old and unfamiliar with the face history, would later put on t-shirts and posters, had nodded him through without a second look. Word travels slowly when a man wants it to. It was already a rumor in California martial arts circles that the top student had begun invoking his teacher's name in ways his teacher had never sanctioned. That student had started closing his exhibition matches with a line that made the older instructors in the room go quiet. That no man alive, credentialed or otherwise, famous or otherwise, could last with him what he had lasted with his teacher. He had said it in San Diego. He had said it in Fresno. He had said it, according to the account passed down, in that Sherman Oaks gym on a March night in 1974, and this time the wrong man happened to be sitting in the 3rd row wearing a black cap. This is the story of what happened when he said it again. The first 25% of any story like this one belongs to the world as it stood before the sentence was spoken, and this one is no exception, because a myth needs its foundation laid honestly before it can be knocked down. The top student had earned the right to say what he was about to say, at least on paper. 4 years under his teacher, a relationship that had begun when he answered a newspaper advertisement at 19 and ended, in the telling, with his teacher personally recommending him for an assistant instructor position he never took because he preferred exhibition circuits to teaching children forms on Saturday mornings. He had good hands. Witnesses in the room that night, 3 of whom are named in various retellings and 2 of whom asked never to be identified, agreed on this much without dispute: the man could fight. He threw a reverse punch that visiting instructors clocked, informally, with stopwatches, and it moved fast enough that grown men flinched watching it thrown at a heavy bag from 15 feet away. He was not a fraud. That detail matters, because a myth about a fraud being exposed is a story about luck, and this was never a story about luck. He opened the evening the way he always did, running a private class of 9 students through combinations against focus mitts, correcting elbow position, correcting weight transfer, correcting the small technical sins that separate a good student from a dangerous one. For 35 minutes he was, by every account, an excellent teacher. 2 of his students that night went on to open their own schools within the decade, and both, decades later, still credited him publicly for their fundamentals, even after everything that followed. The gym itself had a particular reputation in those years, one worth understanding before the rest of the story can make sense. It was not a large school, 41 folding chairs was close to capacity, and on an ordinary Tuesday attendance ran closer to 20. But word had spread through the loose network of Southern California martial artists that this particular teacher, still building his own name at the time, ran the hardest sparring sessions west of downtown, and that his top student in particular fought with something close to contempt for anyone who had not bled for their rank. Visiting black belts came specifically to test themselves against him, and most left having learned something they had not expected to learn. This reputation, earned honestly across 4 years of hard sessions, is precisely what made the sentence he was about to speak so believable to the room. Nobody in that gym doubted that the top student could fight. That is what made what happened next land the way it did. The instructor who ran the school, 22 years old, had inherited the space from an older teacher who had retired the previous year. And he had inherited along with it a certain deference toward the top student, who had trained there longer than the young instructor himself had held his own black belt. It was an arrangement that worked, most nights, because the top student's skill justified the deference. On this particular Tuesday, that arrangement was about to be tested in a way the young instructor had never anticipated, and would spend years describing to other people afterward. It was near the end of the session, with mitts stacked and the class gathered loosely near the front wall, that he began to talk. He talked about his teacher the way he always did, and no one in the room thought anything of it until the tone shifted, the way it apparently had in San Diego and in Fresno, from admiration into something closer to a boast standing on his teacher's shoulders. He said his teacher was the greatest martial artist most people would never fully understand, because the world outside these rooms wanted movie stars and belts and trophies, not truth. Nobody in the room disagreed with that sentiment. It was what came next that the room remembers. He said that he himself, personally, had stood across from every so-called legend the martial arts world liked to whisper about, in exhibition, in seminar, in private sparring, arranged through mutual friends, and that none of them, not one, had lasted with him the way his teacher had once made him last, humbled and gasping, on a mat in 1970. He said the famous names people brought up in bar rooms and magazine profiles were built for cameras, not for rooms like this one. And then he said the sentence that the story exists to be told about, the sentence that 41 people would spend years disagreeing on the exact wording of, though the meaning never changed in any version, that Chuck Norris himself, whatever the magazine said about him, could not last with him what he had lasted with his own master, and that if the man were ever in the room, he would prove it in under a minute. He did not know the man was in the room. This is the second act of the story, brief, because it is meant to be brief. The way a struck match is brief before the room changes color. The insult itself took 11 seconds to say. It became, decades later, the 4 words that would end up on posters and thumbnails and the covers of paperback compilations: "You could never beat my master." A woman in the second row, a purple belt named in some retellings and unnamed in others, said later that the room did not gasp. It went instead very quiet, the specific quiet of 41 people simultaneously realizing they did not know what was about to happen and instinctively not wanting to miss it. The man in the black cap did not move for a long moment. This is part of what the story insists on. Every time it is told, he did not stand quickly. He did not stand angrily. 6, maybe 8 seconds passed, long enough that a few students in front had already turned back toward their instructor, assuming the moment had passed uneventfully, before the third row creaked and the man in the black cap rose to his feet the way a man rises who has done it 10,000 times and has stopped noticing the motion. He removed the cap first. He folded it once along its existing crease and set it on the folding chair he had just vacated. Then, and only then, he spoke. He has already lost. Someone near the front would later remember him saying, though whether the words were spoken to the room or simply thought aloud has never been settled. He just does not know it yet. The recognition moved through the room the way a current moves through still water, 1 row at a time, the purple belt in the second row turning first, then 2 brown belts near the mirror, then the instructor himself, 22 years old, going pale near the front wall as 40 years of magazine covers and dojo photographs assembled themselves into a face he had let through his own front door. Without a second look, the top student did not recognize him yet, That is the detail every version of the story insists on keeping, because it is the hinge the whole thing turns on. He was still talking, still describing what he would do to any man foolish enough to test the claim, when the instructor said his name, quietly, the way you might warn a friend about to step off a curb into traffic. Chuck, before what happened next unfolds, second by second, the way the room remembers it and the way it has been told in every honest retelling since. If the ritual and the room and the folded cap and the sentence about losing without knowing it have earned 30 seconds of your evening, staying through to the end is where the private sentence lives. The one only the top student ever heard in full, and what he chose to do with it afterward. Subscribing costs nothing and tells the algorithm this story is worth telling again. The confrontation, as it is told, unfolded across roughly 38 seconds, though the room's memory of it stretched those seconds into something closer to permanence. It has been decomposed 100 times in the retelling, and this is one honest attempt at that decomposition. Second one. The top student turned fully toward the sound of his own name and found himself looking at a face he had spent 4 years hearing his master mention, always with respect, sometimes with the particular caution one competitor reserves for another he genuinely rates. His hands did not come up, his weight did not shift back. The purple belt in the second row would later say his expression did not change at first, as though his mind had not yet finished the arithmetic his eyes had already completed. Second 2 through 4. The man in the black cap, no cap remaining, closed the distance between them without hurry. The kind of unhurried walk that reads as confidence to some rooms and as something closer to threat to others. He stopped 8 feet away. 8 feet is not a random number in this telling. It is the distance a man keeps when he wants a full second of warning before anything can reach him, and every witness who studied distance work that night understood exactly what the number meant, even if they could not have told you the mechanics of why. A fight, in the version of the lesson passed down from that room, is not two men hitting each other. A fight is a negotiation about distance, conducted before either man throws a single technique, and the man who understands the negotiation has usually already won it before the first punch is thrown. Second 5 through 11. The top student, to his credit, recovered his composure with real speed, the speed of a man who has faced pressure before and knows the shape of his own fear well enough not to be ruled by it. He said something conciliatory, the exact words disputed but the tone agreed upon, an attempt to walk the sentence back, to reframe it as respect for his teacher rather than disrespect for the man now standing 8 feet in front of him. The man in the black cap did not respond to the words. He responded to the stance, watching the student's weight settle onto his back foot, watching his hips square instead of angle, small mistakes that a man who had spent decades reading opponents would clock without needing to think about clocking them. Second 12 through 19. The student threw first. This detail matters in every honest version of the story, because the story only works, morally, if the challenge is accepted rather than initiated. A reverse punch, the same one visiting instructors had once clocked with stopwatches, thrown fast and thrown correctly, aimed with real intention rather than a testing jab. It was, several witnesses agreed afterward, a genuinely good punch. It did not land. The man in the black cap did not block it in any way that resembled the blocks taught in the room's own curriculum. He did not parry it outward. He slipped it, rotating perhaps 4 inches, letting the fist pass close enough to disturb the air near his ear, close enough that 2 students in the front row would swear for years afterward that they heard it pass. Second 20 through 26. A second attempt followed immediately, a low round kick aimed at disrupting the base rather than scoring outright. The kind of setup technique a smart fighter throws to create an opening for what comes after. It also did not land, though this time the man in the black cap did not merely slip it. He stepped inside its arc entirely, closing the distance the 8 feet had been protecting, so that the kick's power dissipated harmlessly against a target that was simply no longer where the kick had been aimed to arrive. Second 27 through 32. The third attempt was the fastest, and the most committed, a combination rather than a single technique. The kind of flurry a cornered fighter throws when 2 failures in a row have started to compress his confidence into something closer to panic. 3 strikes thrown in under a second, aimed with genuine intent to end the exchange decisively. None of the three connected. The room, watching, understood by this point that they were not witnessing a contest. They were witnessing a demonstration, though only one of the two men involved seemed to fully understand which one it was. Second 33 through 38. The finish, when it came, was a single technique, a spinning back kick that traveled with the speed and mechanical precision that had made its owner famous in exhibitions on the other side of the country. Stopped 1 inch from the top student's temple and held there, motionless, for a full 2 seconds while the room, 41 people, produced no sound at all. Outside, on the boulevard, traffic continued exactly as it had 10 minutes earlier, indifferent to what had just happened 40 feet away behind a plain warehouse door. A forklift moved cargo somewhere down the block. The world does not pause for the moments that reorganize a room's understanding of itself, and this story has always insisted on remembering that indifference, because it is part of what makes the moment inside the room feel earned rather than staged. 38 seconds in front of a teacher's own bloodline is a different kind of 38 seconds than 38 seconds in an empty gym. And everyone in that room, including the top student, understood the difference without needing it explained. The foot came down. It did not come down fast. The man in the black cap lowered his leg the way he had raised it, without ceremony, and extended his right hand toward the student who had, seconds earlier, told a room full of witnesses that this exact man could not last with him what he had lasted with his own master. The student did not take the hand immediately. This is the fork in the road every version of the story eventually arrives at. The moment the entire narrative exists to set up, because what a man does with his own humbling reveals more about him than the humbling itself ever could. He stood there for what witnesses remember as a long 3 or 4 seconds, his chest still rising and falling from adrenaline rather than exertion, since the exchange itself had cost him almost no real effort at all. And that absence of exertion seemed to trouble him more than the defeat itself. Then, something in his shoulders loosened, the particular loosening of a man choosing honesty over the easier road of excuse, and he took the offered hand. What was said next, the words exchanged in the roughly 4 feet of space between them, has never been fully agreed upon by the room, because the man in the black cap leaned in and said it quietly enough that only the student himself, and possibly the instructor standing nearest them, could hear it in full. 2 witnesses, close enough to catch fragments, have offered partial versions across the decades that followed, versions that agree on tone if not on every word. Something about respect being a thing you extend rather than a thing you claim on someone else's behalf. Something about a teacher's name being heavier to carry than the student had understood. Something the student himself would later describe, in a single interview given many years afterward and rarely quoted in full, as the sentence that changed how he taught for the remaining 30 years of his career. He chose the harder road that night. He did not offer the easier version, the one the fork in the road always makes available. The quiet excuse about being misquoted or misunderstood, or simply performing for a room that expected boldness from him. He apologized in front of his own 9 students, plainly and without qualification, and asked the man in the black cap to correct him publicly on the exact nature of what his own master would and would not have wanted said in his name. A brown belt near the mirror, one of the 2 students who would go on to open his own school, reached out afterward and touched the departing man's shoulder as he collected his folded cap from the chair. A small and instinctive gesture several witnesses independently reported, as though he needed the contact to confirm that what he had just watched had actually occurred and was not some trick of. The gymnasium's poor lighting. The man in the black cap left without further comment. He did not stay to be thanked. He did not stay to be photographed in an era before photographs were easy to take anyway. He simply walked out into the March night past the idling delivery truck that had by then long since pulled away, and the room behind him spent the rest of that year. And then the rest of that decade retelling what they had seen to people who had not been there, and watching the story mutate a little further with each telling, the way oral history always mutates. Gaining a detail here, softening an edge there until the version that survives in dojos today bears only a family resemblance to whatever exactly occurred on that particular Tuesday. The top student, for his part, never repeated the claim again in public. Former training partners who crossed paths with him in later decades described a man who had grown noticeably more careful with other men's names, who had developed the habit, unusual in a profession built on confident self-promotion, of crediting his own students generously and rarely mentioning his own record at all. Whether that carefulness traces directly back to a single Tuesday evening in 1974 is not something that can be proven. It is, at minimum, the story his own students eventually came to believe, and told to their own students in turn, until the lesson outlived the precise facts that had originally carried it. There is a version of this story where the moral is about humility, and there is a version where the moral is about the difference between a claim tested in a controlled exhibition and a claim spoken carelessly into a room that might, on any given night, contain the very man being discussed. Both versions are true enough to be worth telling. The room in Sherman Oaks did not need the second version explained to them. They had watched it happen in 38 seconds, and they carried it with them into every gym they walked into for the rest of their lives. The story did not stay contained to that single room for long. Within a month, versions of it had reached schools in San Diego and Fresno, the same cities where the top student had first made his claim. Carried there by visiting students who had themselves heard it secondhand from someone who had been in the Sherman Oaks gym that night. By the time it reached those rooms, certain details had already begun to shift, the way details always shift in stories told aloud rather than written down. In one Fresno retelling, the exchange lasted closer to a full minute rather than 38 seconds. In a San Diego version, the folded cap became a folded jacket, and the 8 feet of measured distance became 10. The core of the story, the insult and the instant, quiet reckoning that followed it, never changed. Only the ornamentation around it drifted. The way a photograph left in sunlight slowly loses its edges while the shape at its center remains recognizable. Years later, long after the top student had stopped repeating the claim that had once defined his reputation, a journalist working on a retrospective piece about Southern California's martial arts scene in the 1970s tracked down 3 of the original 41 witnesses and asked each of them, separately, to describe what they remembered. Their accounts diverged on small things, the exact wording of the private sentence chief among them, but converged completely on the shape of the evening, a confident claim, a quiet man in a black cap, and 38 seconds that ended an argument 4 years in the making. The journalist never published the piece in full. A fragment of it survived instead as a single paragraph in a martial arts newsletter, and it was that fragment, copied and recopied across message boards decades later, that carried the story into the era when it could finally be told to an audience far larger than a converted warehouse gym in Sherman Oaks ever could have held. A man's story about what he has survived and what he can actually survive are 2 different things, and only one of them holds up when the wrong stranger happens to be sitting in the 3rd row. Next week, the story moves east to a converted television soundstage in 1978, where a stunt coordinator with a reputation for testing every leading man who walked onto his set would learn. In front of a full crew and a rolling camera nobody thought to stop, exactly the same lesson the hard way. Until then, if this story earned its place in your evening, say so in the comments and tell the story your own way to someone who has not heard it yet.